Good evening, good afternoon, good morning from wherever you are watching from in Ireland, the United States, and indeed other parts of the world. Thank you very much for joining us and a very warm welcome to you all. In case you don't know me, my name is Jackie Goodall and I am the founder and executive director of the Ireland-Israel Alliance, an Irish NGO that engages with supporters and organisations from both secular and religious backgrounds and from across the political spectrum. We are absolutely delighted to have this opportunity to partner with Camera's Partnership of Christians and Jews to bring you an informative and timely discussion entitled Interfaith Dialogue: What Effect Does It Have on Israel's Legitimacy? Now, the whole area of interfaith dialogue has been on my mind for some time. More recently, we have witnessed where it can be a wonderful vehicle for promoting peace and reconciliation, as in the recent Abraham Accords, where Arab and Jewish cousins are now rekindling ancient friendships and establishing open and warm business and cultural relationships. However, when often well-meaning dialogue veers into areas that suggests or seeks to replace Israel or question Israel's legitimacy, that should be an area of concern to all of us, regardless of our personal religious or non-religious convictions and affiliations. In Ireland and in the United States also, we must ensure that churches are not used as a principal vehicle to make anti-Israel extremism appear respectable, mainstream, and humane. We hear so much these days about social justice, but Israel must not and should not be used as the eternal scapegoat. Because the Jewish community in Ireland is so small, there is not the pushback you would see in, say, the United Kingdom, for example, to go against organisations that promote a Christian anti-Zionist perspective. And these, unfortunately, are often not adequately challenged. We know, for example, that individual Catholic bishops, a Church of Ireland priest, and Christian development charities have been at the forefront of support for the discriminatory and illegal control of economic activities occupied territories bill, which has now been restored at committee stage in Dáil Éireann, the Irish Parliament. This is a bill that has been described as the most aggressive boycott measure targeting Israel, the national homeland of the Jewish people, in European history. It's also a bill that seeks to criminalise Irish citizens with fines of up to €250,000 and a 5-year prison term for the crime of purchasing goods and services from Jewish Israeli traders in Judea and Samaria and in parts of Jerusalem. It's also a bill that impacts the religious freedoms of Irish people enshrined in Article 44.2 of the Irish Constitution. And so I am delighted to welcome Dexter Van Ziel, Shillman Research Fellow, and Reverend Dr. Tricia Miller, Christian Media Analyst at Camera. Dexter Van Ziel has written extensively on the subject of interfaith dialogue, and he will speak today about how ecumenical organisations such as the World Council of Churches have allowed interfaith dialogue to become a platform for anti-Israel propaganda. The Reverend Dr. Tricia Miller will then discuss the foundation of much of the Christian anti-Israel propaganda, which includes replacement theology, the lack of understanding of the Jewish roots of Christianity, and the false identification of Jesus as a Palestinian. The discussions will last approximately 40 minutes in total, after which we will invite you to take part in a lively Q&A before we conclude. And we would ask you to please post your questions in the chat box below. So without any further ado, I would very much like to welcome Dexter Van Ziel, thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. And I just want to thank Jackie for organizing this webinar and for that kind introduction. And before I begin, one of the things that I should do is to give our viewers in Ireland a little bit of background about CAMERA and our partnership of Christians and Jews. And our work is similar to that of the Ireland-Israel Alliance. We work to counter anti-Israel propaganda in our respective communities, or as IIA puts it, we work to bring clarity to the conflict. CAMERA was founded in the early 1980s in response to the poor coverage that was given to Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982. And at the time, the media downplayed the fact that the PLO was using that country as a base of operations to attack Israel. News outlets portrayed Israel's invasion of Lebanon as something that came out of the blue and not something that happened after years of terror attacks from that country. And one of the things we do is we've got letter writers who point out problems in coverage related to Israel, and they ask people to correct the record. And we also have a number of researchers who work in Israel and the United States who will reach out directly to reporters and editors and inform them of the mistakes and ask them to correct. And we deal with outlets in Israel because, oddly enough, some of the worst problems with the coverage of the Arab-Israeli conflict come from newspapers such as Haaretz. They might get the story right in Hebrew, but then get it wrong in English. And so we have a whole thing called the lost in translation genre devoted to basically highlighting that problem. And so essentially what we've got is we've got Israel covered, and we have the English-speaking world and the Spanish-speaking world covered as well. And this past year, CAMERA got 222 corrections from media outlets throughout the world. And by getting these corrections, we're able to remove falsehoods that would live forever online. That's one of the problems that we deal with. And we also stop these errors from being repeated. And we're also sending a continuous message to the media that we're watching them. And that's a very important thing to do, because if they know that they're being watched, I'm a former newspaper reporter myself. And if I know that there's somebody in my audience that knows that I'm going to, that I might make this mistake, and that I know that I'm going to be called out on it, I'm more likely to actually check a second time to make sure I got it right. And we do this work essentially in the belief that public policy can only be based on an accurate understanding of the facts at hand. And oftentimes when societies and governments make bad decisions, it has a lot to do with being rooted in bad journalism. And so we also work to counter anti-Israel propaganda on college campuses through our CAMERA on Campus program. Because one of the things that we have found is that anti-Israel propaganda has an impact on the environment that Jews live in. And I'm a Roman Catholic, but essentially that's really one of the reasons why I do this, is because essentially I find it personally, like Jackie, I find it very important to be part of a movement that makes sure that that lies about Israel don't translate into hostility towards Jews. And one of the things that I want to do is to basically plug our website, so that if you are in a discussion with somebody either online or in person, you can go to our camera.org website and just plug it in and say, well, what does resolution 242 really mean? Just plug that in and you'll find it. And you don't even have to give us credit. You can use the information. But so I think really one of the things that I started working at CAMERA about a decade ago, largely in response to anti-Israel propaganda that was coming from Christian churches here in the United States. And, you know, in the course of doing this work, I ended up having a crash course in interfaith relations, and started with Christian-Jewish relations, then quickly had to deal with issues related to Muslim, Christian, and Jewish relations. And one of the things that I saw was that the churches that I dealt with essentially after the Holocaust basically said, we have to rework the way that we speak and talk about Jews, and even pay some attention to how we speak about Israel. The problem was because essentially it was very clear that while, you know, that Christianity was not, what happened was that Christian anti-Judaic and anti-Jewish sentiment within the Christian world helped lay the groundwork for the Holocaust in Europe. And there was an awful lot of Christians that realized that they had a stake in the success and welfare of the Jewish state. But what happened was that after Israel became a more powerful state and won some wars, people started to get a little bit uncomfortable with this whole notion of Jewish power. And another thing was that there was a legitimate concern to make sure that they didn't demonize other people because of what they had learned as a result of the Holocaust. And after 9/11, there was a great concern to make sure that these churches didn't demonize Muslims because of the actions of a small number of people who attacked the United States. And so that prompted a reluctance to address issues related to dhimmitud, which is essentially the status of non-Muslims in Muslim-majority environments, and Sharia law. And that had an impact because a lot of the churches that dealt with the Arab-Israeli conflict didn't really want to have to address the religious component of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And so, and the thing is that I started out very pessimistic, but I've gotten much more optimistic over the years, in large part by seeing some of the efforts at reform within Islam by folks like Tariq Fatah. And also, I think that the Abraham Accords has actually been kind of a shock to the system to an awful lot of so-called Christian peace activists, because they said for many years, look, you're not going to be able to fix the Middle East until you come to some sort of, we bring the Israel-Palestinian component of this conflict to an end. And as it turns out, essentially, a number of Arab and Muslim countries have said, look, we're no longer going to use Israel and the Jewish people as a hostility towards those people and Israel as a unifying political agenda, because we need to basically build a future for our people. And unfortunately, the people who really need to learn that lesson are, in fact, Christians now in the West. And I just recently wrote a piece on the Times of Israel website that said, it looks as if some Muslims are actually learning a lesson that many Christians have forgot, which is that we need to not use the Jewish people as a scapegoat and for an explanation of all of the things that go wrong in our world. And one of the things that I have learned is that essentially the anti-Israel narrative promoted by church and parachurch organizations over the past 2 decades is a threat to good interfaith relations for a number of reasons. The two being is that, first of all, it will cause churches to backslide on the lessons they learned in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And secondly, by being so reluctant to speak about issues related to Islam, they're actually making it harder for people within the Muslim community to address these concerns on their own. And you'll see some of that as I get going on this. There are 2 moving parts to the process that I've kind of witnessed over the years. What has happened is that a lot of the people in the more progressive or ecumenically minded churches have basically become part of an anti-Israel propaganda machine. And the first moving part of this propaganda machine is comprised of Christians who live in the Holy Land who broadcast anti-Israel propaganda. And then the second moving part of that is institutions in the Holy Land, in the West, such as the World Council of Churches and World Vision that these Christians influence. And those are just 2 of the institutions that I've mentioned. And I've dealt with, but there's a lot of institutions that have embraced this anti-Israel propaganda. And I think in recent years, in part because of the COVID-19 crisis, they've dialed it back. But what I'm worried about is that once this crisis is past us, if it ever is, I don't know, I'm just wondering, but I hope it will be, is that as years that they will go back to this anti-Israel propaganda habit. Now, the Palestinian Christians, they live in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, and also in East Jerusalem. And they live mostly in a Muslim majority environment and are oftentimes subjected to hostility and harassment from their Muslim neighbors. And the PLO, which governs the West Bank through the Palestinian Authority, has a history of anti-Christian hostility and enmity. but it's not something that Christians living under its control really want to talk about. Almost 45 years ago to the day, PLO fighters murdered more than 500 inhabitants of a Christian village of Damour during the Lebanese Civil War. And the murders began on January 20th, 1976, and lasted for a few days. And a Catholic priest who witnessed the massacre described the event as follows. He said they were slaughtering everyone in their path, men, women, and children. Whole families were killed in their homes. And I'm going to leave out some of the details because it's not good for a family environment, but and a few of them were left alive afterwards. Now, the PLO, to the best of my knowledge, has never apologized for this massacre, and yet the Palestinian Authority, which is, essentially a PLO, is controlled by the PLO, has been able to enlist Christian leaders, especially those affiliated with Bethlehem Bible College, an evangelical Protestant school located in the West Bank, in its propaganda war against Israel. And the Bethlehem Bible College, one of the things that they've done is that essentially they organize these Christ at the Checkpoint conferences that bring Christians in from the West, and in particular the North Atlantic West, which of course Ireland is a part of. It's like Europe and North America. And they basically fan out the Palestinian Christians. That what they have done is that they've established relationships with the various denominations throughout the North Atlantic West and in other parts of the world to tell the anti-Israel story. And one of the reasons why, and they deploy and use Christian theology, anti-Judaic passages, or an anti-Judaic worldview to basically demonize Israel. They'll portray the Jewish state as essentially oppressing Christians the same way that the Jewish establishment oppressed and fought against Jesus in first century Jerusalem. Or they will portray the modern state of Israel as the equivalent of ancient Rome. That's and the information, I've written about this so much that at a certain point the stuff starts to fall out of my head. And the reason why they do that is so that they can elicit feelings of solidarity from their Muslim neighbors by condemning Israel. And they can also prove their value to the Palestinian Authority or Hamas, depending on where they live, by defaming Israel to Christians living outside the Holy Land. And they do this through supporting organizations such as Sabeel Ecumenical Liberation Theology Center, which is headquartered in Jerusalem, another organization called Kairos Palestine, and also the previously mentioned Christ at the Checkpoint conferences that I've mentioned. And these organizations conduct tours and conferences attended by Christians from outside the Holy Land. And what happens is the people who attend these conferences will then go back home and essentially tell people that that Israel is largely at fault for the conflict. And the thing is that because they've been to the Holy Land, they have a certain amount of credibility. And there's a tremendous desire on the part of an awful lot of progressives in the Christian community to basically somehow demonstrate just how authentic they are and just how concerned they are for the downtrodden. And going to the Holy Land and siding with the Palestinians against Israel is a very easy way to do that. It's a low-cost way to basically virtue signal, if you forgive me. And one of the things that they'll do is they'll come back to their home communities and promote the BDS campaign, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions campaign. The second moving part that we have to deal with is the umbrella ecumenical organizations, such as the World Council of Churches, and also a charity like World Vision. Now, the World Council of Churches will use anti-Israel propaganda as a unifying agenda, and the World Vision will use an anti-Zionist or anti-Israel narrative to essentially raise money for their charity, which actually does good work throughout the world. And what happens is they offer up a distorted narrative about the conflict and say, well, you need to give us money so that essentially we can help the Palestinians. And what happens is that they'll end up essentially subjecting Israel to intense theological scrutiny and not really subject the Palestinian elites to any criticism. And as a result, that's basically, the result is essentially an anti-Semitic narrative, because when you portray Israel as singularly at fault for the conflict, the implication is that the Jewish people and Israel itself, they could unilaterally bring an end to the conflict, but won't because of some flaw in their character, which is either rooted in the Old Testament or in the Holocaust, or in the Bible or in the Holocaust. They'll say the Jewish people are too badly damaged to make peace when there's an opportunity for it, because they're too frightened and they haven't gotten over the Holocaust. Okay, and anybody that's been to Israel knows full well that Israel is essentially it's committed to the future. That's I don't want to get too much into that, but essentially they are committed to essentially achieving autonomy and exercising their agency as human beings, and that's one of the reasons why I like to go to Israel. I haven't been able to go recently, but that's why I like it. And the thing is that they will. These institutions, particularly the World Council of Churches, will essentially offer up an anti-Israel narrative that delegitimizes Israel in a very profound way. Now, the WCC, it's an umbrella organization for about 350 Protestant Orthodox churches. It was founded, interestingly enough, in 1948. And after it was founded, it expressed concern for the safety and well-being of the Jewish people, but has largely been hostile to the state since, particularly during times of conflict. And for example, during the Second Intifada, they issued a number of very hostile statements that I've written about. And I don't want to get too deep into it, but if you just go to CAMRA's website and plug in the World Council of Churches, you'll find a lot of the articles that I've written. And interestingly enough, what they've done is that they listened to the Palestinian Christians and another organization called the Middle East Council of Churches, and they have prevailed upon this organization to condemn Israel, just the same way that the Russian Orthodox Church was able to prevent the WCC from condemning the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s. The WCC, has member churches throughout the world. And there are some places where they have to be very careful about how they speak about issues, because if they're too robust in their criticism, they're going to put Christians in danger. And that was true. It's true in the Middle East, and it was also true in the Soviet bloc, in the countries as well. The Russian Orthodox leaders said, if you condemn Russia too vocally as a result of the invasion of Afghanistan, we're not going to be able to participate in the World Council of Churches anymore. And so that has been a real problem, because it's very safe to condemn the West and the United States, and it's also safe to condemn Israel, but it's not so safe to condemn Israel's adversaries. And interestingly enough, the World Council of Churches has created two institutions that are basically dedicated to essentially assailing Israel. The first one is the Palestine-Israel Ecumenical Forum, where basically pastors and theologians subject Israel to theological scrutiny and say very little about Palestinian elites. Nothing about pay to slay, nothing about incitement on Palestinian television. It's all Israel all the time. And then there's another organization called the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program in Palestine, Israel. And that touches on a little bit of the information that I talked about earlier about activists going over to the Holy Land, and they'll bring the EAPPI, or EAPI for short, will bring people over for 3 months at a time. They will essentially stand in solidarity with the Palestinians when they're in confrontation with Israeli soldiers, and then what happens is that they will turn the cameras off when the Palestinians do bad things. I've talked to Israelis who said, yeah, that's what they do. They're not really all that interested in detailing or documenting the misdeeds of the Palestinians. And so, interestingly enough, the WCC has not established a bureaucracy to deal with the oppression of Christians in Muslim majority environments. And by the way, CAMRA did 2 conferences about this subject, about the oppression of Christians in Muslim majority environments about 10 years ago. And I remember at one of these events having a woman whose a Christian woman here in the United States whose family lived in the Middle East, and she was crying because it was the first time that anyone had basically wanted to hear her story. And she heard her story told by the people that we had gathered here at an event in Chicago. It was very moving. But the interesting thing is that the WCC, and I'm going to go into a little detail, its executive committee, it met a few months after that massacre that I mentioned that took place in 1976, the Darmoor massacre, where about 500 to maybe, and the numbers vary. I've seen 500, 1,000, or 1,500 Christians that had been killed just a few months before. And the thing was, the executive committee issued a statement that said that the conflict in Lebanon is essentially political and not religious. And the thing is that there was clearly a religious component to this massacre, and the killers said so. They yelled, "Allahu Akbar, God is great, and let us offer a Holocaust to Muhammad," as they were perpetrating the massacre. And so I've seen a lot of anti-Israel propaganda. And for example, the EAPPI volunteers, they once accompanied a particularly aggressive Palestinian activist by the name of Hassan Breja as he harassed Israelis living in the West Bank. This happened in 2016. There's video of it, and I wasn't there when it happened, but I've been provided with a video. And I challenged the World Council of Churches with this video and said, what happened here? And I didn't really get much of a response. And during one of these confrontations, Breja yelled at Israeli, telling them to leave their land and telling them that they were illegal. And he has also written a terrible poem that basically incites, murderous hostility towards Jews living in the Holy Land. And the WCC has also supported the work of another individual by the name of Youssef Daher, a Palestinian Christian who posted hateful anti-Israel propaganda on his Facebook page. And in one article that he wrote that Jesus's critique of the Pharisees precisely reminds us that the Torah does not center on love and genuine justice. Okay, that's not good interfaith dialogue. And what has happened is that the WCC has has supported people who basically said some very horrible things about Israel that aren't true, and in some instances have basically incited violence against Israel. And so, another piece of the puzzle is local manifestations of groups like Sabeel and Kairos Palestine that exist, that are headquartered largely in the Holy Land. Sabeel was founded in the 1990s by Naim Atik, and he's written stuff like, the Israeli crucifixion system operates daily in the occupied territories. That's straight up anti-Semitic rhetoric, quite frankly. And then there's Kairos Palestine, which is another organization. When Sabeel took a hit, in large part because of the work that Camera did, they had to come forward with another organization called Kairos Palestine. And that was led by an individual by the name of Rifat Odi Cassis, who worked for the World Council of Churches. And they issued a document in 2009 that said that the occupation was a crime against God. But they didn't say very much about what the Palestinians had done wrong. And in response to this document, the Central Conference of American Rabbis said, this is essentially like they used the Bible to essentially try to sweep the Jews from the land, and then at the same time affirm the Palestinian connection to the land. And it was all documented, and it was right there. And so the thing is that there are local manifestations of both of these organizations in Ireland. And I don't want to pretend to be an expert about who's responsible for what in Ireland, but if you go to the Kairos Island website, you'll see that the organization has issued a statement lamenting the German government's decision to declare BDS as an anti-Semitic movement. The BDS campaign has been the primary vehicle for anti-Israel activism because it gives people a chance to tell stories of Israelis and Jews behaving badly to whatever institution they try and get a BDS resolution before. And whether or not the resolution passes, it doesn't matter. Because what happens is that they'll use these resolutions, they'll get it on the agenda, and they say, well, why should we boycott Israel? And they then will list a whole laundry list of atrocity stories that, and it's used as a pretext to lie about Israel. And it's happened on a regular cases. And I've been at an awful lot of these church-wide assemblies, and I've been to Sabeel events. And the things that people will say are just, they're shocking. But the thing is it doesn't matter whether or not these resolutions actually pass. In one instance, the United Church of Christ, the church that I grew up in 2015, they passed a divestment resolution. And 4 or 5 years later, I looked into their investments. And, the pension board of the denomination still own the stocks that were listed in the BDS resolution. And so the whole thing basically was just revealed to be an opportunity to demonize Israel. And once they passed the resolution and got the publicity that they were looking for, they just moved on. And so the thing is that all of these institutions, they have an explicit commitment to promoting interfaith relations, particularly between Christians and Muslims, often at the expense of respect for the Jewish people and their homeland, and indifference towards Christian suffering under Muslim rule in the Middle East and North Africa. And that has been particularly true of the WCC, but it's gotten better. And I don't want to go on too long, but for example, in 2010, the then General Secretary of the World Council of Churches offered his condolences to the death of Sheikh Tantawi, the Grand Mufti of Al-Azhar University, saying that the Sheikh would be remembered with great respect and appreciation for his prominent role and genuine commitment to interreligious dialogue. And that's a paraphrase, but it's all there. I've written about it before. And the problem is the Sheikh was a notorious and inveterate anti-Semite who mined the Quran and the life of Muhammad for passages and teachings that justify Islamic Jew hatred. For example, in 2002, he declared that Jews are the enemies of Allah, descendants of apes and pigs. And he later retracted this statement, largely in response to pressure from the Egyptian government, because the Egyptian government didn't want that. But they've also he legitimized suicide attacks in Israel in the aftermath of 9/11. And the thing is that the World Council of Churches had no business lauding an individual like this. And I've seen other events. I was at an event in 2006 that I've written about. You can find it online. I think the headline of the article is Interfaith Dialogue is Necessary but Risky. It was organized by the United Church of Christ. And one of the discussants was a Muslim scholar who was subsequently deported from the United States and sent back to his native Pakistan on charges of immigration fraud. And when he got back to Pakistan, he became a spokesperson for a charitable front organization, a charitable front for a jihadist organization that perpetrated the Mumbai massacre in 2008. And so this is very, very troublesome. And there's other stories I could tell, and I don't want to get in too much into it. But at one point, the Bethlehem Bible College, they organized a Christ at the Checkpoint conference, and they showed a video of an imam who falsely declared that Palestinian leaders never taught children to hate Israelis, which was a clear falsehood. And I was sitting in the audience, and I don't know, there was several hundred people, and I said, I wrote an article about it, and people in the audience knew that what he was saying wasn't true, but they applauded anyway because they didn't want to be rude. And the problem is that by highlighting these types of folks within the Muslim community, the reformists, they don't get the support that they need. And so I don't want to leave you with a pessimistic view, because I think there's a fair number of people, the Abraham Accords is really good evidence for me that people no longer want to use, at least some people within the Muslim world don't want to use anti-Semitism and hostility towards Israel as a unifying political agenda, and that they actually really want to address some of the real problems that their country's facing. The UAE, I'm a great fan because they have a space program. They are sending a probe to Mars, and it's called the Hope, which I think is wonderful. So what can we do? And I think one of the things that people could do in the next couple of weeks is to start to pressure the Palestinian Authority to apologize for the Damour massacre in 1976. This is the 40th anniversary. It took place, started on January 20th, which is 13 days from now. And I think that would actually kind of force a lot of the pro-Palestinian groups in the West to basically, we can challenge them and say, look, if you're really serious about being peacemakers, well, you're going to have to start speaking the truth. And you're going to have to start leaning on the Palestinians to address the issue of incitement, address the issue of pay to slay. And you know what? Maybe you can start by apologizing for the Damour massacre. And that would actually be a good start, I think. And so at this point, what I want to do is turn the discussion right now over to Tricia Miller so that she can talk about some of the more theological, the issues of replacement theology. And I just want to thank everybody for being on the call.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you, Dexter, for that very informative presentation. Thank you, Jackie, for your introduction and for all the good work that you're doing in Ireland. Good morning, afternoon to everyone listening in the US, and good evening to everyone in Ireland, the UK, and Israel. Thank you for all joining us today. We have people here from California to Israel. As Jackie mentioned, we're going to have a time for questions at the end. So if you haven't done so already and you want to ask a question, move your cursor to the bottom of your screen, click on the Q&A icon, and type your question in the box that appears. Dexter has already given an excellent introduction to CAMRA and CAMRA's partnership of Christians and Jews. So please go to our websites for more information. It's www.camra.org and www.camraspartnership.org. So I want to talk today about some of the beliefs that form a substantial part of the foundation of the Christian anti-Israel movement and discuss how these particular beliefs can be used in interfaith dialogue in relation to the question of Israel's legitimacy. First, I want to define what I mean by the term anti-Israel. I'm referring to opposition to the existence of Israel as a Jewish state in the ancient homeland of the Jewish people, the land of Israel. By this definition, to be anti-Israel is to deny the Jewish people's right to self-determination in their own land. And I'm particularly concerned with the objection to Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state that is embraced by far too many in the Christian world. It's extremely troubling that in the decades since the Six-Day War in 1967, in which surrounding Arab nations once again attempted to annihilate the Jewish state, substantial parts of the organized church have succumbed to the millennia-old practice of delegitimizing, demonizing, and dehumanizing Jews. Today, this delegitimization, demonization, and dehumanization occurs under the guise of anti-Zionism, and Israel, the collective Jew, is the target. It's quite alarming that in more recent years, those who identify as evangelicals, the members of Christendom who have historically been the most supportive of Israel, have been targeted with a pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel narrative specifically designed to turn traditional supporters of Israel away from that support in favor of the Palestinian political narrative. And Dexter has done a great overview at all of the different organizations involved in this. So I'm going to keep on discussing the foundation of this. There are a number of ways this Palestinian narrative is advanced in and through the church. But I want to highlight a substantial part of the foundation of the anti-Israel movement, and that is the tenets, the beliefs, and the consequences of an erroneous doctrine known as replacement theology. Replacement theology is the belief that Christians and the church have replaced Jews and Israel in the purposes of God. This doctrine originated with some of the early church fathers just a century or two after the time of Jesus. According to this false belief, since the coming of Jesus, Jews don't have a role to play anymore in the plan of God, and thus there's no reason for their continued existence. Replacement theology is still quite prevalent in the church today, both consciously and subconsciously, and it continues to be a source of serious hostility towards Jews and the state of Israel. The logical outworking of the doctrine that there is no theological reason for the continued existence of the Jewish people is the belief that a Jewish state does not have a right to exist. According to this reasoning, Israel's existence is illegitimate. Adherence to replacement theology is only possible through a particular method of biblical interpretation in which the terms Israel and Jews are not understood as a reference to the literal land of Israel or a literal people of Israel known as Jews since biblical times. Instead, Israel and Jews are understood in spiritual terms. So when believers in replacement theology come across these words in the Bible, they interpret them as a reference to the church and Christians. Well, Palestinian Christian theologians have their own version of replacement theology that replaces Jews and the purposes of God through the claim that Palestinians are the indigenous people of the land. According to this false belief, the Jews who now live in Israel are of European descent and only appeared in the land in the 19th century. In this way, Jewish identity and historic connection to the land is denied through the claim that Palestinians are the indigenous people of the land. So in other words, the Jewish state is illegitimate and everything it does to protect its people from attempted annihilation is illegitimate as well. The assertion that Palestinians have owned the land for 2,000 years promotes a political cause, but it also has other far-reaching ramifications. One of the logical outcomes of the assertion that Jews are not indigenous to the land is the identification of Jesus as a Palestinian. Well, after all, how could Jesus be Jewish if there were no Jews in the land when he was born there? Well, every Christian listening to this webinar who knows their Bible knows that in order to identify Jesus as a Palestinian, you have to do great violence to everything the Bible says about the Jewish identity and the Jewish historical context of Jesus. You have to rewrite or ignore huge portions of scripture, which is exactly what Palestinian Christians do who promote this belief, in order to promote a political cause that denies Jews the right to live in their historic homeland. The invention of a Palestinian Jesus is quite useful for the political purpose of denying Jewish history in the land, delegitimizing the right of Jews to live there now, and advocating for a Palestinian state that, as Mahmoud Abbas has stated publicly, will not allow a single Jew. Indeed, Muslim Palestinians are only too happy to promote a Palestinian Jesus in order to further their anti-Israel political agenda. This reality must be understood and acknowledged in order for any attempt at interfaith dialogue to be effective. If it is not, the truth about Jesus's Jewish identity will be compromised, and Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state will be delegitimized. So I want to briefly summarize what I've said so far. Christian replacement theology concludes that there's no theological support for the continued existence of Jews or the reestablishment of a Jewish state in the ancient homeland of the Jewish people. Palestinian replacement theology denies Jewish identity and historic connection to the land, resulting in the delegitimization of the existence of Israel and the identification of Jesus as a Palestinian. The creation of a Palestinian Jesus is an essential tool used by Christian and Muslim Palestinians in the promotion of an anti-Israel political agenda. And this in turn creates an implicit hazard in all interfaith dialogue that must be recognized, or Israel's legitimacy will end up being questioned. There are other destructive consequences of the erroneous beliefs I just summarized that need to be highlighted. A Palestinian Jesus results in the elimination of Christian history and the delegitimization of the Christian faith. This is because Christian heritage begins with a Jewish Messiah and Jewish disciples who ministered in Judea, called Judea throughout history after the Jews. Indeed, There would be no Christian faith and no Christian history without Jewish faith and Jewish history. Christianity is absolutely dependent on its Jewish roots, as Paul made so clear in his letter to the Romans, chapters 9 through 11. But a Palestinian Jesus denies the Jewishness of Jesus and deconstructs the Christian faith by severing it from its Jewish roots and context. In addition to the violence perpetrated against the Christian faith and the delegitimization of Israel's existence, a belief in a Palestinian Jesus is dangerous for Jews wherever they may live. When Jesus is separated from his Jewishness, the path is paved for the same demonization and dehumanization of the Jewish people that resulted from the Nazis' identification of Jesus as an Aryan. This is because the separation of Jesus from his Jewish identity prepares the way for Christian rejection of the Jewish people. And this is exactly what happened in Germany in the years leading up to the Holocaust, which resulted in the murder of 6 million Jews throughout Europe. German theologians helped the Nazi cause by denying Jesus's Jewishness. Instead of acknowledging his true identity, Jesus was turned into an Aryan as the Nazis developed their plans to annihilate the Jewish people. It was necessary for the Nazis to separate Jesus from his Jewishness to prepare a nation that identified as Christian to accept the persecution and murder of the Jewish people who are the biological relatives of Jesus. So too today, it's necessary for Christian and Muslim Palestinians to deny Jesus's true identity for the purpose of winning support from Western Christians for the Palestinian political movement that denies the Jewish state the right to exist. So again, I want to summarize briefly what I've said. Christian replacement theology inevitably results in the conclusion that Jews have no right to exist. In the case of the Holocaust, this is what much of the German church believed, that God was finished with the Jews and they deserved to be punished. As a result, the German church as a whole either did nothing to help the Jews, or worse, they aided and abetted the Nazis as they systematically murdered Jews. Palestinian replacement theology concludes that the Jewish state has no right to exist and provides a theological foundation for Christians who oppose the existence of Israel. As in the case of the Holocaust, this theology can be used to justify the murder of Jews and the destruction of the Jewish state. This false ideology, as embraced by the Palestinian Authority and other anti-Israel Muslims, is dangerous because it offers justification for the delegitimization of Israel's existence, and it manifests in violence against Jews. In closing, I want to give you just one example of a quote from a Palestinian leader that demonstrates how Jesus is identified as a Palestinian and then used as an example of a Palestinian fighter and martyr. Keep in mind, this is just one current example, and things like this are said frequently by Palestinian leaders and theologians in the course of promoting the Palestinian political narrative. The quote I'm about to give you was documented in a report on January 3rd of this year, just earlier this week, from Palestinian Media Watch, which monitors what is said in the Palestinian media and translates it from the Arabic. The official Palestinian Authority daily, Al-Hayat Al-Jadida, reported on December 28, 2020, that in a speech at a Christmas dinner, the PA's Prime Minister, Mohammed Shateya, said, and this is a quote, "Our Lord Jesus, peace be upon him, the first Palestinian self-sacrificing fighter from whom we learned martyrdom death and who paid for his mission with his life." As you can hear in this one sentence, the Palestinian Prime Minister not only identifies Jesus as a Palestinian, but he describes Jesus as a, quote, self-sacrificing fighter who taught Palestinians martyr death. To understand the seriousness of this description of Jesus, you need to know that the PA uses the expression self-sacrificing fighter to identify terrorists who have been murdering Israelis since 1965. So when Shataya says that Jesus was the first of these fighters, he's saying that Jesus is the example for how Palestinian terrorists should murder Jews. This is certainly not the description we have of Jesus in the Gospels. And when Shataya says that Jesus taught Palestinians martyr death, he's actually identifying Jesus as a Muslim, since it is the teachings of Islam that glorify death as a martyr and promise the martyr 72 virgins in paradise. Again, this is totally inconsistent with the Jesus of the Bible. Prime Minister Shataya went on to say, quote, "The birthday of our Lord Jesus takes place at the same time as the anniversary of the outbreak of the Palestinian Revolution, for which thousands of martyrs have paid with their lives." End of quote. Well, obviously, any association of the celebration of the birth of Jesus with the Palestinian Revolution and the death of thousands of martyrs, who by definition are martyrs because they died attacking and killing Israelis, obviously, this association is extremely repulsive for Christians. And remember, this is just one example of frequent statements made by Muslim and Christian Palestinian leaders and theologians that identify Jesus as a Palestinian. And in the process, they deny Jewish identity and historic connection to the land. They deconstruct the foundations of Christian faith by severing that faith from its Jewish roots, and they delegitimize the existence of the Jewish state. So what does all this have to do with the question we raised through this webinar, which is, what effect does interfaith dialogue have on Israel's legitimacy? The short answer is this: the belief system that forms a substantial part of the foundation of the Christian anti-Israel movement can and does influence interfaith dialogue. And in keeping with the movement's belief, that effect can be quite negative in relation to Israel's legitimacy. The use of a Palestinian Jesus for the promotion of an anti-Israel political agenda is a reality that must be understood, and it must be acknowledged in the context of any attempt at interfaith dialogue, or else Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state will be delegitimized. So while we all hope for positive results and the building of relationships that can result from genuine interfaith dialogue, we need to be aware of the possible hazards. Genuine interfaith dialogue and relationships must be built on a foundation of truth in order to be effective. This means that truths such as Jesus's Jewishness, the Jewish history in the land of Israel, and the right of Jews to self-determination in their ancient homeland cannot be compromised or ignored in the process. So that's a good place for us to stop right now, because we do want to have time to take some questions. So Jackie, I'm turning it over to you for the questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Tricia, and thank you very much, Dexter. There was a lot of information there. It's great to hear it, because I know you guys are researching and writing about these topics on a daily basis, on a daily, weekly basis. So we looked at, well, Dexter looked at the number of organizations who are actively involved in this type of dialogue, which basically is replacing Israel. Organizations such as the World Council of Churches, the EA, PPI, the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program in Israel and Palestine, which you mentioned, Dexter. They're probably not doing an awful lot at the moment because of the pandemic, but who knows when that might change. We've got Christ at the Checkpoint and Kairos Palestine, which of course Kairos Palestine opened an office here in Ireland in December 2018. So yeah, really just to conclude before we start our questions. Their interfaith dialogue is great and can be very, very positive indeed as far as establishing and warming relations between Jews, Christians, and Muslims are concerned. But when it veers into questioning Israel's legitimacy, we have some serious questions to answer. So thank you very much for that. I'll go on to I'll just go on to the questions now. We've got quite a lot of questions coming in, which doesn't surprise me at all, because the discussion has been so interesting. Okay, in Ireland, this is a question related to Ireland in particular, but I think it could also relate, obviously, to other places, because these type of charities exist all over the world. In Ireland and perhaps many Western countries, anti-Israel activists infiltrate organizations and church groups generally weakened by secularism in society to dictate policy. An example here is the main Catholic development agency, Trócaire, which regurgitates anti-Israel propaganda. How do our speakers feel that this can best be reversed? Tricia, would you like to answer that one?
I think Dexter's probably, I think I'd pass out to Dexter because he deals overall with that kind of information, those organizations better.
I think one of the things that we need to, and I am unmuted, I just want to make sure. What you can do is look at what we did with the Catholic Near East Welfare Agency, which is an organization that operates in the Holy Land. What you can do is, the first thing is to just document the things that they say that aren't true. And one of the things that you have to understand is that any relief or development organization that operates in the Holy Land, you're going to have to essentially understand they have to have good relations with the Palestinian Authority and Hamas if they operate in the Gaza Strip. And one of the ways that they can essentially get good relations is to essentially kind of beat up on Israel and offer up an anti-Zionist narrative. And one of the things that I've learned about when I've read about World Vision, which is another relief and development organization that you have to pay very close attention to, is that when they operate in an area that's controlled by warlords, which is essentially what Hamas is, they have to essentially kind of toe the party line. And one of the things that means is actually handing, in some instances, assets over to thugs and bullies. So I don't know what Trócaire is doing, and forgive me if I've mispronounced the name of the organization, but the first thing you need to do is to just document what they've said, look at it and say, is this how you're going to raise money here in Ireland? You're going to raise money by offering up a distorted narrative about the Arab-Israeli conflict? Is that right? Is that fair? And the thing is that then you can say, and there's numerous Catholic documents out there issued by popes and also the Second Vatican Council that say, look, you can't do this. You can't use the Jewish people as a scapegoat or a negative foil to highlight your work. So there's a lot of, and if you've got information, go to our website and submit a tip. If you go to camera.org and you send us links, I can write about it.
Okay. Thank you, Dexter. I've got an interesting question here from somebody who says, I'm not clear as to the precise objective of interfaith dialogue. What faiths are involved? I think we're talking about all faiths, and I think we're also talking about people who are of no faith either, actually believing some of these narratives, some of these stories. Dexter, would you like to comment on that?
Sure, I think Tricia might want to comment on it as well. I think from my perspective, the Holocaust essentially really kind of demonstrated the importance of people who have different religious beliefs talking to one another. And one of the things is that our religions, they do a couple of things. One of the things is that they tell us about God. And then they tell us about the people of God. And then they tell us about people who are outside the faith. And that's structurally just how it is. And so I think, you know, one of the and I support interfaith dialogue because it's an attempt to basically reduce the number of times that we kill each other. That's really what it is. And I think that when people use their religious faith to build themselves up and to establish their connection with God, that's a very important thing, and that's a good thing. But then when they use aspects of their faith to demonize people outside the faith or even within the faith, that can be very problematic, and it defames God himself when you do that. So, you know, I have a tolerance or I support interfaith dialogue. The problem is that I want it to be truthful, and that can be a difficult thing because you don't want to offend the other people who are involved in this discussion. And also, but the thing is that when you're involved with dialogue, you know, we were quite clear that the Jewish community said, look, there are elements of the New Testament that say very mean things about Jews in the first century, and also and have been used to demonize us. Can you do something about that? And I think that similar challenges can be leveled at the Muslim community as well. And I want it done in a polite and respectful manner that takes into account the things that they've already done to fix the problem. And that's why I'm so hopeful about the Abraham Accords.
Well, let me jump in here. I think that when we talk about, to address your original question, when we talk about interfaith dialogue, that we're talking primarily Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, three-way. Of course, there's other people who get involved in interfaith dialogue, but we're talking about the three major faiths, I think. And over the last few decades, there's been a phenomenal amount of progress in Jewish-Christian relations and Jewish-Christian dialogue, which is wonderful, and it's healing for members in both communities. And what we have in common is the vast majority of the Christian scriptures and all of the Hebrew scriptures we have in common. We're in agreement on that. And Jews and Christians, when they get engaged in this dialogue, have been honest about what the differences are. We agree that we don't believe the same thing about Jesus or who the Messiah is, those kind of things. But we have so much in common based on the Hebrew scriptures that there's so much in common to focus on that's what's important. When you bring Muslims in, and I'm all in favor of interfaith dialogue, like we've all been saying, but you're dealing with a different set of holy scriptures for one thing, and a different source of authority for them, and different. So there needs to be the same kind of clarification that there has already been established in Jewish-Christian relations, that certain things are, this is what we believe and we will not compromise. And so I said, it's important, like I said at the end of when I spoke, it has to be based on truth. And there has to be the recognition that these are the certain things that Christians believe, that Christians who read their Bible actually believe and see. It's very clear that Jesus was Jewish. You can't replace that with a Palestinian Jesus. You can't rewrite history. You can't rewrite a narrative for the purpose of a political agenda. And so that's the point I'm making, is that this interfaith dialogue, bringing Muslims in, is full of territory that needs to be clarified, and that Christians need to stand firm on, and that they can't compromise their Christian beliefs in order to have dialogue with Muslims, and vice versa. You know, nobody's asking Muslims to compromise their beliefs, but it has to be two-way, and it has to be honest. And if I can take the liberty, because I see one of the questions in the question list, Jackie, if I can take, because it's kind of related. Somebody asked a question about how Christian are these Christians, and they put the word Christians in quotes, in their justification for anti-Israel sentiment, when the Bible clearly states that we need to support Israel. Well, that question is coming from someone who obviously believes the scriptures that are, you know, if you read the scriptures literally, that's what Christians who support Israel do, and see that God continues to have a purpose for the Jewish people and for Israel. But where it gets messy is how you get replacement theologies when you start reading the Bible figuratively, where Israel and Jews, those two words, start to mean something else. They mean Christian, they mean the church instead of Jews and Israel. And so it boils down to, in the evangelical world, and that's where I focus and that's where I work. That's why when you ask questions about other organizations, and especially Catholics, that's why I said Dexter is the expert on that, because I'm focused on the evangelical world and admonishing and urging evangelicals to really understand what the Bible says, to stay true to what the Bible says and understand that. So I don't know if that helped answer that question for the person who asked it, but it all boils down to how do you read your Bible? How literally do you read your Bible?
Okay, yes, no, thank you for that. And actually, when the question was asked, I actually smiled because I was at a webinar last night, or a Zoom call last night with David Rosen, Rabbi David Rosen, who spoke about the whole area of interfaith dialogue and the very positive aspects there are to it, especially when we look at the Abraham Accords. But he said that religion has become a political tool, and it can actually be used. Religion can be used as a political tool, and I think that is what we're talking about here when interfaith dialogue becomes a problem because it is used as a political tool to replace Israel and to replace the Jewish people as the indigenous people of Israel. And that, of course, is where the whole area of Jesus being a Palestinian, etc., that Tricia spoke about comes to the fore. With regard to how we really got about to this whole area, and why I reached out to both Dexter and Tricia, was because I actually came across a little pocket guide, pocket facts guide for Jewish, Christian, and Muslim people. A lovely little booklet which I came across a few months ago. I wasn't aware of it before. It's published by the Three Faiths Forum in Cork, and I don't, as I say, I don't really know much about them, but they're basically an initiative that brings together representatives of the three Abrahamic faiths, they say, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, seeking to create a space where people of faith can dialogue openly and respectfully. So that's wonderful. And as I say, that was what I suppose gave me the idea to reach out in the first place. Tricia or Dexter, did you get a chance to have a look through the Three Faiths Forum booklet, or is that something that you come across in the States?
Well, you see, now I did actually write an article about that, and one of the interesting things that I saw is that it seemed as if they downplayed the status of Jesus as the Son of God. And for me, that was kind of an interesting thing, because, you know, if you asked me, you know, having been to Sunday school, you know, what about Jesus? I'd say, well, he's the Son of God. That would be one of the first things that I said. And I think, and that was one of the things that made me a little, you know, uncomfortable. It's like, well, why would they downplay that? And one of the things that I do know is that essentially within Islam, there is a very strong critique of the notion that Jesus is actually the Son of God, because that would be an example of ascribing a partner to God, which is one of the things that you don't do in Islam. And so that was, I think, one of the things that really kind of made me wonder, are the people who were involved in this booklet, particularly on the Christian side, more interested in being nice and actually enunciating the tenets of the Christian faith. And another thing was that it was pretty clear that they didn't actually acknowledge, from what I read of the document, Jesus's Jewishness. And Tricia has already spoken about this at length. And this is one of the things that, I get nervous about, because whenever you basically, kind of downplay the Jewishness of Jesus, it's possible to use him as a weapon against the Jewish people.
Right.
And that's really, and that's one of the things that Christians have done. They basically used him as a scourge of judgment against the Jewish people. And I've argued and had some very bitter arguments with people about that. And it's an unpleasant issue, but it's one that we have to address. And the concern that I always have, and that has manifested itself, is our desire to improve relations with the Muslim community going to come at the expense of our repentance over the violence against Jews perpetrated by Christians throughout the century. And that's something that's always basically been important to me. And I've seen that process, I think, play itself out. And at the Christ at the Checkpoint conferences that I've been to, one of the things that they'll say is to American evangelicals and also to other evangelicals, but mostly American evangelicals, is that they'll say, your support for Israel, it's making it hard for us to share our faith with Muslims throughout the Middle East, because, and the thing is that it's like, well, the problem is that what it seems as if, and if I'm going to put it in blunt terms, you want us to throw Israel under the bus so that you have an easier time getting along with Muslims in your community. And that is a very troublesome rhetorical move. And so that's always been something that's been of concern to me. And just one last point, one of the interesting things about the Abrahamic faiths, and I don't want to overemphasize the similarities between them or to basically paper over the differences. But the one thing is that we all worship a God who intervenes in history. One way or another, that's what the God that we worship has done. And when you look at the history of these three faiths, the way that we have behaved in history has kind of blasphemed oftentimes the name of God himself, particularly in our violence against Jews. And that is the one, if I were involved in this discussion, that would be, let's get real about how we have blasphemed the name of God who works in history, and talk about that and see if we can't come up with a better way of interpreting our scriptures so that we don't do that anymore. And that's basically how I'll leave that issue.
I'll just add on a little bit to that, Jackie, because I also read the booklet that you're talking about, and I had the same concerns. Dexter's already verbalized it, that seemed it was a weakened representation of Christianity. And that's, and to use Dexter's term of throwing Israel under the bus, my concern, as I've already said in my talk, to put it in Dexter's words, are we going to throw Christianity under the bus in the desire to get along or to reach some kind of agreement with Muslims? Because that's not happened in Jewish-Christian dialogue. We have not had in Jewish-Christian dialogue, the Jews understand that Christians believe in Jesus as the Son of God and as Messiah. And Christians understand that Jews don't believe that. And that is accepted on both sides. And we talk about all the things that we do have in common, and we build genuine relationships. So the question I'm raising, and what I hoped, came across when I spoke, is we Christians cannot sacrifice the truth of what our scriptures tell us about Jesus in order to try to have, a conversation with Muslims, because it has to be based on truth. So that's what I just wanted to throw that in.
Okay, great. Thank you. I have another question here. Is there any organization that's formally approaching the PLO for an international apology on the anniversary of the Damore massacre? Is there a petition that can be signed? I must admit, I
Not
haven't
yet.
seen. No.
And when I say not yet, I say not yet with a twinkle in my eye. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
So you
Okay.
watch this space.
Great.
We've got about
Great.
13 days, and hopefully by Monday or early next week, you know, we'll have a fact sheet that people can use to raise the issue.
That would be great. So we will make sure that people have sight of that, either by going onto your website or by going onto the Ireland Israel Alliance website. But we'll certainly follow that up, because we want to make sure that that we're actually taking action as well, following this this discussion. Quite a few questions. Okay, we were 1:45 now. I think we have time for a few more questions.
We should maybe just do one more.
Just one more? Okay.
Well, we haven't lost that. I mean, people have actually hung in there. It looks like we've got a fair number of attendees. You know what?
Yeah.
I'm willing to. I can hang in there.
Okay.
Okay. Well, we'll see how quickly we get the questions answered as well, I suppose. that has to be taken into consideration. Okay, of all the media outlets, what percentage of errors are you successful in having them retract their statements? And is there any particular media organization which is more amenable to retraction?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
If we post this video on YouTube, I can talk to my colleagues at camera and say, who do you have the best luck with?
Yeah, yeah, I know. Some are pretty good here in Ireland. Well, it depends really. Okay, let's have another. Oh, somebody has just said there's another theory that Jesus was Druze, and alleged that Jesus' maternal line was of Druze.
Don't know anything about that either.
Never heard of that.
Yeah.
Never heard of that. Will there be a transcript for this wonderful presentation? Well, we're hoping to have it released on.
There will be a recording, and when the recording is available, we'll send an email out to everyone who attended with the link to them.
That's great. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Okay, this is actually a very pertinent question and very much related to what you were speaking about, Tricia, and that is what explanation is given as to why Palestine is not mentioned anywhere in the Bible? And this is something that is quite close to my heart as well, because I have seen maps of Palestine in church buildings, in Sunday school rooms, and I have questioned it on more than one occasion. So perhaps Tricia, would you like to answer that question as to why Palestine is not mentioned anywhere in the Bible?
Okay, because the Hebrew Bible is talking about the history of the Jewish people, and the land is always referred to as Judea and Samaria in the Hebrew Bible. That continues into the Christian Testament, the Newer Testament. I was about to go off. Let me just go off, okay? Because when I said the Newer Testament, I had wanted to mention this earlier. There is a new translation of the Christian Testament called the Hebrew Heritage Bible that's just been translated by Dr. Brad Young, Professor Emeritus from Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And that is an excellent, I had wanted to bring this into one of the discussions we were having, but if you want a translation of the Newer Testament, he and I, and a lot of us don't like to say New Testament, because even in that term, there's connotations of new and old, of replacement and supersessionism and all of that. So anyway, I recommend that Bible, because the reason it came to mind here in answering this question is because what he's done is use all of the Hebrew names for everyone in the Newer Testament. For example, Mary is Miriam in Hebrew. Remember, all of these people in the gospel stories were Jews. The mother of Jesus, who got the Greek name, got Mary in the Greek versions, it's Miriam, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so what that translation shows is what I was talking about, the Jewish context, the Jewish heritage of Jesus. So the name Palestine does not appear because it didn't exist in the biblical time period. In Jesus's time period, it was also known as Judea. It became known as Palestine in the 2nd century after the Bar Kokhba revolt against the Romans, and the Romans defeated that revolt, and they kicked a lot of the Jews out of the land. They took over Jerusalem, they kicked them out of Jerusalem, and they renamed it Palestine. It's a play on the word Philistines. They were intentionally insulting, hurting, pouring salt in the wound, however you want to describe it, of the Jewish people by renaming the land in remembrance of their ancient enemies in the Hebrew Bible, the Philistines. So it became known as Palestine in the 2nd century. And then it stayed that way through the British Mandate. It was called, the British had the mandate after World War II, or after World War I, to govern the land. And in the Jews who lived in the land before 1948 called themselves Palestinians. They were the Palestinians. The first Jewish newspaper in the land was called the Palestinian paper. They were the Palestinians. It was the Jewish people who were the Palestinians until 1948, and Israel became a state, and they started calling themselves Israelis. The Palestinians, the people who now call themselves Palestinians, started using that only in the 1960s with Yasser Arafat to try to claim that identity. They're trying to connect themselves to the ancient name Palestine that the Romans gave the land. It's a totally, I may be going too far here, but it's a made up identity. I mean, basically the Palestinians are Arab, they're of Arab descent, and they're trying to claim this identity to claim the right to the land. It's not in the Bible.
Okay. Many thanks for such interesting talks. I'd be interested in hearing about the stance of Catholics living in Israel and in the PA and their attitude towards the state of Israel. My own understanding is that they're mainly Greek Orthodox, aren't they, living in East Jerusalem? Are there a lot of Catholics living?
There are some Catholics. I don't have the number off the top of my head. But the interesting thing is that essentially the new Custos of the Holy Land, a guy by the name of Pierre Pizzaballa, he's actually been very sympathetic to Israel. He's not, the past two, he was the Custos for a long time, and now he's the Latin Patriarch. And he's basically the equivalent of the Archbishop or the Bishop. And I just converted to Catholicism in 2008, so the terminology is not something that I've learned completely, but he's the patriarch, and it's a hugely influential position. The previous two patriarchs were they were not nearly as responsible in their discussion about the Jewish state. And it had to do with the fact that they were essentially recruited from the local Arab population. And one of the things is that they're kind of in a difficult spot because on one hand, they want to basically respect, the tenets of the Second Vatican Council to protect and not engage in anti-Semitism. But at the same time, they sometimes have to deal with issues related to Arab and Muslim hostility towards Israel, and they don't want to get caught up in that. A few years ago, there was a church, the Dominus Flevit Church, which is where tradition has it, Jesus wept, or the Lord wept. There was essentially people that kind of like squatted on the land or engaged in some sort of act to kind of take over part of the land. And the officials involved didn't say a word about it. It said nothing at all about it. And they kept it out of the papers. And I talked to a number of people to confirm that it did happen. And then later, when some extremists from the West Bank, an Israeli Jew, set fire to the Church of the Beatitudes, and more recently the church in Gethsemane, well, that hit the papers, and as well it should, Okay, and because the Israelis are scandalized by that as well. They don't want any of that to happen. But I just find it very interesting that when an Israeli Jew does something to a Catholic institution, that makes the papers. But when the Arabs and the Muslims will do something to a church, say in the West Bank, or even in Jerusalem itself, they're a little bit less vocal about it. And I think but the thing is that the Patriarch Pete Zabala, he's actually pretty responsible in that. He doesn't downplay the fact that the Israelis are outraged by this as well. So I'm kind of happy. And when I go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is run in part by the Catholics and the Franciscan order, I'm glad to be there. And I think they know, if you talk with them privately, they know that Israel, for example, and I don't mean to go on too long, but there was video once of confrontation between two Christian sects within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, because there's multiple sects, the Greek Orthodox, the Armenians, and at one point there was a brawl between two different groups of monks in the church. It was embarrassing for the Christian world. Well, who actually protected the welfare of the Franciscan that was being attacked, but Israeli security guards? And it was ironic. So essentially it was like, here we had an Israeli Jew protecting a Christian from being assaulted against being assaulted by another Christian. It's very ironic. So there it is.
Okay, great. Look, I'll take two more very, very quick questions, because I know time is moving on here. But as you say, we still have a very good number of participants hanging on. So this is a question, actually, and I'm going to ask it because people have asked it of me quite a number of times, and I only know of one Christian organization. But is there a Christian organization which assists Middle Eastern Christians which is pro-Israel, or at least neutral? I know of one. It's called Operation Blessing, and I believe it's they help Christians in Iraq, basically refugees who fled ISIS, and they're stuck in Jordan, actually, but that's the only charity I know of. Do you know of any charities, Dexter or Trish?
I will say that the Iraqi Christian Relief Council, which is led by Juliana Tamarazi, and they're headquartered, I think, in Chicago, she has come to the defense of the Jewish state on a number of occasions. So, and I don't know officially if the organization has taken a stand on it. The problem is that any of those organizations that operate in a Muslim majority environment would have to be very careful about their support for Israel. But I think, even if I knew of, she's been on radio shows, and there are other people out there that are supportive of Israel, but I don't want to put their lives at risk.
I was going to say, I want to say that there are, because I said a lot about Palestinian theologians and Palestinian leaders and believing in a Palestinian Jesus and all of that. But there are Palestinian Christians who are very solidly pro-Israel because they read the Bible and they believe it and they read the whole thing and they don't change things and omit things. And I don't want to mention their names, but we know them, and they are solidly pro-Israel, and they work in cooperation with an Orthodox Jewish organization to help to feed and get supplies to Palestinian Christians who are suffering economically because of living under the Palestinian Authority. So there are Palestinian Christians working together with Orthodox Jews, which is beautiful, to help there locally.
Great. Okay, and last question. I'm sorry, I can't take any more, but the last question. The subject of persecution of Christians was brought up. One of the largest international organizations called Open Doors, which is very influential, involved in helping persecuted Christians, was key in setting up the Bethlehem Bible College. have you ever addressed their anti-Semitism? And that's to Dexter, please.
Well, well, you see now this is kind of there's a certain, somebody from Open Doors actually spoke at our conference in Los Angeles a long time ago. And there are times when they have actually said some things against Israel that were problematic, and I spoke to them about it, and they understood where we came from. The problem is that, see, and this is the problem, is that if you're going to set up any institution in the West Bank, and you get the permission of the Palestinian Authority to operate, you're going to be an anti-Israel institution. That's just how it is. There's another Bethlehem University, which is a Catholic institution. Their website was rife with anti-Israel propaganda, and that referred to cities inside Israel as occupied territory. And so, and I called up their folks here in the United States and got it changed. But essentially, and the problem is that Christians have kind of an obligation to help the beleaguered Christians, even if they're in an environment like the West Bank. And so, you know, I don't want to accuse Open Doors explicitly of promoting hostility towards Israel. But I would say that, yeah, Bethlehem Bible College is an anti-Israel institution. And that's why they run the Christ at the Checkpoint Conference. And so, I didn't know that Open Doors was involved with it, but a lot of evangelical institutions would support money, would probably send money to Bethlehem Bible College, not because they want to promote hostility towards Israel or towards Jews, but because they want to stay in solidarity with their fellow Christians. And it's a knife's edge, and I wouldn't know how to resolve it, because if you operate in the West Bank, you have to beat up on Israel.
And on that note, I just want to say thank you so much, Dexter and Tricia, for doing this webinar. I reached out to you some months ago because I read one of your articles, Dexter, a couple of years ago. It was entitled "Fools on the Ground: The World Council of Churches in Israel and its EAPPI," and I was absolutely stunned to read what was in there. I mean, I'd known some of it, but I hadn't recognized the full extent. So I am so delighted.
I love to be able to do that type of stuff, because it just, you know, and Camera supported my work. They've paid my tuition the past 15 years, and I'm very thankful.
There you go. And Tricia, thank you so much. Your depth of knowledge on these matters is second to none, really. And so I'm sure I'm going to get lots of emails from people who are going to want transcripts, and who will want to maybe get a recording. For those who are worried about a recording of this going about, it's a webinar, so nobody knows who is looking at the webinar or who is partaking. So it's completely confidential. So on that note, thank you very much, and please go on to Camera's website. It's www.camera.org or www.cameraspartnerships.org, and indeed do take a look at our website as well, irelandisrael.ie. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, good evening.